Hello and welcome to the latest interview in the Truth According to series. Today I'm joined in the studio by James Harris, Director of Communications for Dignity in Dying. James, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So let's start off with you telling us a little bit about the organisation and what it's about.
Sure. Well, Dignity in Dying is a campaign organisation and it campaigns for greater patient choice at the end of life. Effectively, we believe that people should have more control over where they die, how they die, and when they die, when sadly death is inevitable and unavoidable. And we campaign for that choice because we believe that alongside access to good quality end-of-life care, that it's the most effective way of alleviating unnecessary suffering at the end of life. And I suppose what we're most well known for as a campaign is that we advocate a change in the law on assisted dying for terminally ill adults, and that change in the law would allow dying people, subject to upfront safeguards, to take control over how they die.
Tell me, where are we at with the law at the moment? Because I believe there's been some changes this year.
Well, there's a potential change. There's a bill before the House of Lords, the Assisted Dying Bill, and that bill is closely modelled on a change in the law that exists in the US states of Oregon and Washington and Vermont. Now that bill, there was a big debate just before the summer recess in the House of Lords, its second reading debate, where they discussed the principle of the bill. And it passed that stage unopposed, and the next stage now is for that bill to have a committee of the whole House of Lords. Well, they'll review it clause by clause, amendment by, and they'll have the opportunity to amend the bill to make it stronger and appropriate for the statute book.
Before we go into what the potential outcome and repercussions could be if that law, does get enforced, talk to me about the different types of dignity in dying, because when I was doing my research I was actually quite surprised that it's quite a minefield, isn't there? There's quite a lot of different definitions, and some countries have certain laws for certain types of dying. Talk to me about that.
Well, what I think is interesting is that once upon a time, the issue of choice at the end of life, it was kind of a theoretical debate. It wasn't, it's been going on for years and years and years. People have been discussing whether people should have choice. But what's changed, I think, in the last decade is that on the ground, other jurisdictions in parts of the world have begun to change their laws. And what that does is it enables us to look at those laws, evaluate them and say, well, what do we think is best practice for Britain? So what I think most Britons will be aware of is that people are travelling abroad to die. So around about 10 years ago, we saw the first Briton who travelled abroad to Switzerland. Now Switzerland, for some time, I think ever since, or at least for 50 years, has enabled its citizens to receive medical help to die if they consider their suffering unbearable. And then what we saw is that the Benelux countries, Holland, Luxembourg, have followed suit, and Belgium have followed suit, but they've brought in their own laws, so they've looked at this slightly differently. And the laws that they've brought in are, in effect, euthanasia laws, and what they allow is doctors to directly help a patient to die. We then have a kind of an American model, which I've already mentioned, that the US states of Oregon and Washington and Vermont have assisted dying laws. So how we would categorise that is that there are kind of three different routes that countries have chosen to go down. The first route is assisted suicide. So that is indirectly, by providing people with life-ending medication, you give them the ability to control their death. That law, that assisted suicide law, doesn't just apply to the terminally ill. It has a wide concept of suffering. So it could apply to people who are chronically ill and other circumstances. The Benelux countries, the Dutch, the Belgians, Luxembourg, they have similar criteria in that the law is applicable to people on a broad concept of suffering. It's not just applicable to the terminally ill. And what they allow is they allow doctors to directly end a patient's life, i.e. they can inject them with life-ending medication and that patient will die. The American model is assisted dying. So they restrict their laws in Oregon and Washington and Vermont to the dying. It's only for the terminally ill, and they do not allow doctors to directly end a patient's life. A doctor, if a patient is dying, if a patient wants control over that dying process, then if they meet the criteria, a doctor will prescribe them life-ending medication, and it is for the patient and the patient alone to decide whether to control their death.
And do they have to administer it themselves, or can they get a friend or relative to do it?
Has to be self-administered.
Okay.
And that's part of the final safeguard, because what this is about choice. It's about someone who requests an assisted death. Has to make a clear and persistent request, but ultimately they have to be the person who decides that they want to bring their life to an end. And the ultimate safeguard for that is to ensure that they are the person that self-administers.
So this is the law that Dignity in Dying are suggesting that we have in the UK?
Yes.
Can I ask why it's perceived to be better that you administer it yourself and not in the hands of a doctor who you would assume is better capable than yourself?
Sure. Well, I think that we already have a problem in this country and in other countries. We have a problem in this country where there is illicit practice. And what this is about is about choice. It's about trying to alleviate suffering, but it's also about having a transparent process that is safeguarded. And I think that that we need to ensure that it is the patient and only the patient that is making that decision to die. And I think that the additional safeguard of ensuring that it is the patient who self-administers rather than the doctor is part of that package that ensures that you have the patient making a clear and settled request, and it is the patient themselves who is controlling their death, and that decision isn't being made on their behalf by anybody else.
Okay, so the criteria for this would
Yep.
be that they are terminally ill,
Yep.
i.e. they're going to pass within the next 6 to 12 months?
6 months.
6 months?
Yep.
And that they are mentally of sound mind?
Yep.
Does that not potentially open up quite a wide spectrum in terms of, I get this sort of mentally, the being terminally ill,
Yep.
but how do you decide if one is mentally of sound mind?
Sure.
Is there tests for that? Because I imagine that's possibly one of the main reasons against it.
Well, yeah, I mean, people have to have mental competence to make the decision, and there are tests for that. So basically, the way that the law works and the way that it works in conjunction with health is that we respect the rights of patients to have autonomy over the decisions about their health care. And one of the key determinants of that is that do they have the mental capacity, do they have the mental competence to make those decisions? Now, there's a previous law, the Mental Capacity Act, which came out in 2005. Now that law defines how doctors and patients are able to make decisions about their future care. So the law that's been proposed by Lord Faulkner in the House of Lords, it has that as a criteria based upon previous legislation and based upon existing practice, that a patient who decides to have an assisted death has the mental capacity to make that decision. And what that basically means in layman's terms is that they have the ability to understand the decision they're making and the implications of that decision.
And there's quite a lot of support in the UK for it, isn't there? I was quite surprised by the overwhelming majority, around 80%.
Yep.
Talk to me about that. I mean, are you surprised by that figure? Because I was.
Okay. Well, I don't suppose I am surprised by it. I think that as a country, it's part of the makeup is that we abhor suffering. We don't want people to suffer against their wishes. And I think fundamentally we respect the right of people to make decisions for themselves. And this is what this comes down to. I think when you look at the polling, there is huge support. I mean, it's consistent. Every single opinion poll ever commissioned shows that an overwhelming majority of the public support assisted dying as a law. Now, it may not be that people want that choice for themselves. They may never want an assisted death. But what I think people don't want to do is to deny that choice to other people.
And what about the health industry? Because that actually has quite an underwhelming level of support.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Are doctors afraid?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think there are kind of historically, I think the medical community has always been slow on the uptake when it comes to kind of sometimes progressive change. I think the public's always been ahead to some degree, whether it's the NHS or whether it's reproductive rights, that the public's been ahead of medical professionals. The medical professionals do catch up. But I think that said, there is a pragmatic and practical reason as to why healthcare professionals are perhaps slightly more sceptical than the public, and that's because they would be involved in this process. What we want to get away from is that at present, people are taking decisions, they're travelling abroad to die, they are taking matters into their own hands, and that's for the lack of an assisted dying law. When you introduce an assisted dying law, what you're saying to people is you need to make an informed decision, and the way to reach an informed decision is to have conversation with healthcare professionals. So they are integral to making this law work. Now, our understanding from looking at the figures, from speaking to and working with supportive doctors and supportive nurses, is there's more than enough. There's more than enough doctors and nurses who are supportive to make this law work in practice. So part of the legislation that's being brought forward is a conscientious objection clause. As much as this is a choice for dying patients to make, there is a choice for doctors and for nurses that if they don't want to become involved in this process, there is no obligation for them to do so.
Talk to me about the pros and cons of this law. What are people saying in support of it, and what are people saying against it?
Sure. Well, I'll probably do a better job on the pros,
yeah.
I would have thought. But, I mean, simply, I mean, in the 21st century, I think that dying people do not have to suffer against their wishes. And I think for the majority of people, thankfully, with access to good quality care, they won't. If you get access to good quality care, most people will not suffer against their wishes. But there is, with any form of health care, there's always, it can't help everybody. And there is a significant minority for whom it can't help. And I think that, A, it's the compassionate thing to do, but B, it better protects people. Because this isn't an issue in a vacuum. People are already taking these decisions without adequate safeguards and protections. All we're saying is have the safeguards in advance. So whereas at present, if somebody was to go to Switzerland, if someone accompanied them, they're breaking the law. They could be liable to prosecution and imprisonment for up to 14 years. Now, in effect, we turn a blind eye to this, and the safeguard against abuse is that we will carry out an investigation after the person's died.
Okay.
And what we're arguing is, well, hang on, if you have the safeguards in front, so if you encourage people to speak to doctors when they're still alive, when you can confirm their diagnosis, their prognosis, their mental competence, that they're aware of all their care and treatment options, that there's a cooling down period, that we think that surely safeguards people than the status quo. So our argument in favour of change is around choice, it's around compassion, and it's around the fact that assisted dying law, we think surely better protects people. If I was to try and do the job of my opponents who oppose the law, I think that the number one concern we come up against, I mean, predominantly opposition is religious. It's not universally religious. There are people who aren't religious who are opposed, but universally that opposition, predominantly that opposition is religious. But one of the pragmatic concern that is put forward, I think most frequently, is the slippery slope. So, if you introduce something that seems quite sensible, it is inevitable that we will end up, as Martin Amos kind of said, I think more tongue-in-cheek, with kind of euthanasia booths on street corners where, in 100 years' time, people just go, right, today's the day I'm going to die. That's their argument, that if you open the door, if you allow people to take this decision when you're dying, then at some point down the line you're going to widen the law.
And what do you think to that?
Well, I understand the fear, but I think you could almost kind of say of any progressive change. I think, and they've argued it with equal marriage, they argued it with lowering the age of consent. It was kind of, where do you stop? Well, I think, society makes a decision at that moment in time as to what it thinks it is appropriate. Now, it may well be in 100 years' time. They talk about the slippery slope being inevitable, that you end up. It could be that it goes the other way. That in 100 years' time, end-of-life care is so improved that it can guarantee everybody with a peaceful and dignified death, and there wouldn't be a need for an assisted dying law. So it could go the other way. But I think there's a slight fallacy in the slippery slope argument. One of the things they point to is that these laws in Belgium and Holland, and there are some cases in Belgium and Holland that I find difficult. I'm sure most people might find difficult because they have a very, very broad criteria of suffering. It's based on a very subjective analysis of an individual who thinks their suffering is unbearable and they want to die. And their argument seems to be that, well, we're going to introduce this law. Well, we're not. We're trying to introduce a law like they have in America. And those laws in America have never widened. They've never changed.
No. And there's never been any calls to widen them either, has there?
No. So the laws they've enacted are the laws they get. And I think that's the argument we should be having now. I would say to people, I would ask opponents, let's have this debate, but let's debate what's in front of us. What we're debating in front of us is, should dying people who are mentally competent have choice and control over their death? That's the argument.
What about the issue of potential exploitation, which I think would be, a strong argument against, in terms of somebody is terminally ill, it potentially is costing their family time and money, in essence. They're putting a lot of pressure on their family, they feel guilty, and then there's this option of a way out. That, I would imagine, is quite a strong argument against.
It is. I mean...
And how do you measure that? I mean, you can't.
Well, I think any progressive change, any social change is about managing risk. It's about what is the risk of change versus the risk of doing nothing. Now, from my perspective, the risk of doing nothing is far greater than the risk of change. For this reason, if people think, well, there are bad people in this world. Most people are good. Most people are well-intentioned. Most people, in fact, from the people I've spoken to, who've taken matters, family members who've seen someone take matters in their hands by travelling abroad to die, for 99.9% of the population, their average response to a loved one wanting to control their death is to not want them to. In fact, the pull is the other way. The pull is not towards having an assisted death. The pull is to please stay with us as long as possible. But we can't avoid the fact that there is the 0.1%. There are bad people. Now,
but would there be anything in the potential law that you're proposing that would safeguard that minority?
Well, that's the argument, which is that that's happening now. I mean, if people feel that they're a burden on their family or society, they're travelling abroad to die. They're 10 times the number than travel abroad to die are ending their lives at home. They're waiting for loved ones to leave the house before they take their life, and their loved ones come back to find them dead. There's illicit practice, happening with people effectively being euthanised by doctors illegally. And
in the UK now?
In the UK, and there are no safeguards. There is no transparency. Now, I would much prefer that rather than someone who feels they're a burden and wanting to die, having no one to talk to, and using the internet as their kind of counselling tool, and then taking matters, I would much prefer that we as a society were much more open. We allowed people to go and speak to their doctors and say, look, I'm thinking about having an assisted death, and there being an opportunity for the doctor to speak to the patient about that and to get to the bottom of why the patient wants to have an assisted death. And I think that those checks and balances, the calling off periods, the fact that you have to speak to a second doctor, I think you're more likely to pick up on issues around burden, on issues around people being coerced, than you are at present. So it's about, I think, a change in law doesn't just have the compassionate case. It has the case in favour of being more stringent.
But assisted dying is meant to take place within the last couple of weeks of that person's supposed life, isn't it? So that they're terminally ill, they've been given a stretch of time, and it's you've got 2-3 weeks left. Is there not an argument to say, and forgive me for saying it the way it's probably going to come out, but you've suffered that long, it's not like you're suggesting that people, that they get assisted death 6 months in advance. You're talking the last couple of weeks of their life. Why not wait?
It's their choice. It's their choice. I think that what has sadly spurred on this movement and this campaign is that a lot of people have sadly seen somebody they love have a bad death, and that has an impact. It has an impact because it can change your perception on someone's life, because someone may have led an absolutely wonderful life, and then because they have an absolutely rotten couple of weeks at the end, you know, that's the memory you're left with. And a lot of people wish that their loved ones didn't have to go through that, and B, think to themselves, well, if I'm in that situation, that's a choice I would like for myself. And that's what it comes down to. I think, you know, when we change the law, the majority of people will continue to have, you know, what is effectively known as a natural death. That will be the way that most of us die, and that was the way that I would prefer to die. But given the circumstances being different, and given, let's say, me knowing that, you know, my last few weeks could be pretty grim, I certainly would like the option of a more peaceful death.
What about the issue, and we've touched on it briefly, but about the fact that people are going abroad, you know, places like Switzerland, to die, and you touched on the fact that cases aren't sort of reported on or investigated until that's happened and their loved ones come back. What are the implications for the people that go with that relative? Are they then subject to prosecution because they travelled with that person? And in effect, is that assisting someone?
It is effective. If you're accompanying someone abroad, well, let's go back to the law itself. Is the suicide law now, because people are ending their lives, and that law is kind of almost unique in law, because something that is not criminal for you to do yourself, it is criminal to assist in, and there are good reasons for that, because you need to safeguard and protect people against abuse and coercion. Now, what effectively happened is that the statute, the law, says you assist someone, you're liable to prosecution for up to 14 years. Now, but the law put in a kind of clause. It said, because I think even at the time they wrote the law, they realised there could be a massive discrepancy in cases. There could be the difference from, say, a mob chanting for a depressed person to jump from a tall bridge through to a loved one helping someone near the end of their life. So there's a massive variation in cases. So what the law says is that every case must be reviewed by the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the Director of Public Prosecutions must make a decision on whether that person is prosecuted. Now, what we found in practice was that for people who were accompanying someone abroad, for example, the police knew about it. There would be an investigation, but there was very, very rarely a prosecution. And so what has happened recently, in fact back in 2010, is the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, he clarified the law. He set out guidelines for and against prosecution. And he said that if you meet these criteria, you're more likely to be prosecuted. If you meet these, you're less likely. As a kind of result of that, what's effectively happened is we've kind of decriminalised compassionate amateur assistance. Now, this creates problems because it falls upon the husband, wife, brother, sister, partner to be the assister, to be the person who takes someone abroad, or even to help them domestically. The problems are, A, if you're doing it domestically, it isn't an easy thing to do, and it can often go wrong. It can often cause massive, distress to the person you're trying to assist, and obviously yourself. This is a loved one, and it can go wrong. We would never, obviously, advise people to do that. You then have people going abroad. Now, they come back, and even though it's effectively decriminalised, they're kind of treated like criminals. So even though the end result is most likely there will not be a prosecution, they have the police turning up at their door when someone's grieving. They have computers taken away. They have the house searched. They have the funeral delayed. So on top of having seen someone you love die, and you're processing that, you're dealing with that, you've got the added problem of the potential threat of a prosecution, but the impact of the investigation at that time you're grieving.
So that must lead to quite a lot of people who want to travel abroad to die to go alone.
Some people go alone. Another problem of going with the kind of travelling abroad is that it costs money. So you're effectively saying there's a two-tier process. For those that can afford it, they can have an assisted death in Switzerland, but you've got to get there. And if you're very ill, it's not the easiest thing to get to. I mean, I know of one case where a husband, because his wife, who had cancer, was so adamant she wanted to go to Switzerland to die, he paid for an air ambulance to take her from Britain, to fly her directly to Switzerland. Most people can't afford that. Most people can't, and the journey is difficult. If you're very, very ill, the journey to Switzerland is very, very difficult. So it's not an ideal process.
Can you talk to me about the research and reports from Oregon? Because the law that potentially we're aiming for in the UK is based on that.
Yeah.
And I believe the figures are quite substantial in support of it over there. Like you've mentioned the fact that it hasn't escalated. People aren't asking for the laws to be widened. And actually, what I was quite surprised about was the number of people in Oregon that have inquired about assisted deaths haven't actually gone through with it, which I found quite astonishing. The numbers were really low that actually went through. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think it ties into an earlier question you asked me around, why not allow people trust doctors? Why not allow doctors to directly end the patient? It's part of that. It's part of the additional safeguards in Oregon that we think are more appropriate for Britain, and it's because this is a safety net. People who are going to die will be worried about the process of their death. It gives them enormous comfort, a lot of enormous comfort, to know that there's options available, and that they can discuss that option. Now, it's like anything in life. Just because a choice exists, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to go through with it. So a lot of people will take comfort from the fact that they can speak to the doctor about it, and flesh through some of the reasons as to why they want to have that assisted death. Now, as I also previously mentioned, is that it's an opportunity to talk about alternatives. It's an opportunity for the doctor to say, well, have you tried palliative care? Have you tried hospice treatment? So it is natural that process of raising and then discussing, there are going to be a lot of people that think about it and say, actually, no, that's not the choice for me. Another key element of the Oregon law is that people who qualify for the prescription of life-ending medication don't all go through with it. They all have access to the prescription of life-ending medication, but around about a third of them don't choose to have an assisted death. The mere knowledge that they have access to it is sufficient for them. So if one day they wake up and say, you know what, my suffering is absolutely so unbearable, I now want to die, they know they have that option. So it's almost a safeguard for them. It's a safeguard to ensure against a bad death.
Why do you think that law in the US is better than the ones that you've already touched upon in the Dutch countries, where it might not be that you're terminally ill, but you suffer with an incurable disease that is causing you unbelievable pain, and you're gonna go downhill. There is no way. I mean, why is that better? Because some potentially might argue that you may have 10 years to live, but you're in so much suffering and pain that you want to end it now. Tell me why you think that's better, that we go for the other option.
This is probably the most. I think this is the most difficult argument and element of this debate. For me, the difficulty is not around whether the law should change. I think the difficulty is well, where do you draw a line? And I think that we have to draw a line. With laws, you have to have criteria, and that criteria has to balance a process based on compassion with safeguards. Now, my attitude to this is that there's a difference between the right to die and the right, when dying, to die well. And what I mean by...
Say that again?
So I believe there's a difference between the right to die. I don't believe we have a right to die. I don't think we have a right to say, help me to die. But I think what we do have is, when we are dying, when that process is inevitable, when we sadly can't avoid the fact that we're going to die, we do have a right to die as peacefully and comfortably as possible. And the reason why I don't support a wider right to die is it just creates, for me, too many difficulties. For the cases I have huge sympathy for, under the same criteria, you would have people falling in that you would think, actually, I feel very uncomfortable about that person having an assisted death. Now, another way that we would look at it would be, or I look at it, is that there is a difference between somebody making a judgment call on the quality of their life and somebody making a judgment call about the quality of their death. So what assisted dying is about is someone making a judgment call on the quality of their death when they are dying. But with quality of life issues, there is very much the prospect that people may adjust, that it may improve. So over time, there is the ability for people's quality of life and for them to view it differently down the line.
Okay.
So, but with a quality of death issue, they're going to die. This person's going to die. This is about the quality of the process of that death which is happening.
I mean, I'm not saying, at the end of the day, we're all going to die. I get that. But if somebody has I'm talking about an incurable disease, they have cancer, they have a life crippling illness. They are waking up every day, but they know they've got 10 years, or they know, they've been given 5 to 7 years. Just because it isn't 6 months, I mean, you're essentially saying, right, we'll suffer for 5 to 7, 8 years, however long you've got, and then you might qualify because you've only got 6 months, but you have been put through hell.
Yes, and it's because we don't ever pretend that the assisted dying bill is a catch-all piece of legislation that is going to eliminate the suffering of society. It is a specific piece of legislation that is aimed at a very specific problem, which is that people, when dying, sometimes die badly. That's what that law is trying to solve. My analysis from looking at the other laws in the world and to looking at the wider problem is that, yes, part of me thinks in some of these very, very difficult cases, yes, I really do wish that person perhaps had the option, but I personally cannot think of a law that adequately works to safeguard people to have that choice. I fear that if you have a wider law that works for people who may have years and years and years to live, you also enable people you feel very uncomfortable with having that choice, who you really wish didn't have that choice of an assisted suicide or euthanasia. So I think that we have to draw a line. Now, another aspect is, I think we have to differentiate between these issues. I think we need to debate them, but we need to differentiate them. We need to have a debate about the right to die well when dying, and what does that involve? And there needs to be a wider debate about the kind of broader concept of the right to die when people are not dying, but consider their suffering unbearable. Now, one of the problems about intertwining the two debates is that when framing an assisted dying law, you've got a balancing act. You are trying to, provide sufficient safeguards to prevent abuse, but you're also trying to create a process that is unonerous on the dying person. If you create a process that has so many loops to jump through, you're going to have people who won't be able to use the law because it becomes too difficult to use the law. Now, let's take someone who isn't dying. Let's take someone who has become, let's say, for example, recently severely disabled through an accident. I can't see how the same law works, because you would want a whole series of other safeguards and criteria for that person. And I'm not an expert on how that law might work, but you certainly wouldn't want the same law that would work for someone who was applying for an assisted death because they were dying. Someone who, say, had recently become, and I know this from conversations with some disabled people that I spoke to about this issue, it could take a long time to adjust to your life as a disabled person.
Listen, you mentioned disability, and the figures show that the majority of people with the disability are in favour of this legislation. Is that because they're more likely to understand how it would feel to be in that suffering? Because although 80% generally of people showed their support, didn't they?
Well, I think there's not a huge amount of difference between the levels of support from disabled people to non-disabled people. I think that there is no difference, really. I think there's a kind of unified view from the majority of people that why should somebody have to suffer against their wishes on account of the beliefs of other people? And I think that's a kind of almost universally held belief, irregardless of whether someone's disabled or not disabled. Also, I think it's interesting when you look at the issue of faith, because the image is that organised religion is against the change in the law, But when you look at the polling, again, a majority of people of faith support a change in the law. So I think it's almost people of faith support a change in the law, disabled, non-disabled, cross political party, left, right. For me, it goes beyond being political. It's almost it's a human issue.
Is it our right as a human to make that decision?
I think it's our right as a human not to have to suffer at the end of life. I think it's our right to have a peaceful death when dying.
Okay, so as a society as a whole, and obviously I'm not asking you to speak for everyone, but do we mind talking about death, do you think? It's one of those subjects that a lot of people, they feel very uncomfortable about, can't possibly talk about the end.
Do you know, I'm torn about this a little bit, actually, because I think there's a kind of perception that we are. I think there's a media perception that people are, and I think politicians think as well, but death's a difficult subject, we don't want to talk about death. I don't know. I mean, from my own personal experience, when I'm down the pub with friends or speaking to family members, I don't want to dwell on the subject. I don't want to spend my whole time in the pub talking about it. But I've never picked up on people being unwilling to talk about it.
Is it a subject that you find, being in the position that you're in, you often get challenged on, because it is a contentious subject? It is you are usually on one side of the fence or the other. Do you find that people, when you're down the pub, want to say to you, yeah, but James, have you considered this?
You get a slight kind of, if you're getting a taxi or you're getting your hair cut, when you're getting your hair cut, if it's a different hairdresser, because they're remembering asking, what do you do? It depends what mood you're in. Do I want a 15-minute debate on assisted dying? But
while you're getting your hair cut.
When I get my hair cut or when I'm in a cab, what I've always found is it's like the polling really is 9 times out of 10 people are very supportive. They'll talk about it with me, and very, very occasionally do I have someone who turns around and says, actually, I am really, really opposed to that. I think it's happened once, I think.
Obviously, you're in a difficult position. You're the front man, I guess, in some ways, in terms of talking to the media and speaking out about this issue. What I was quite surprised about is the number of celebrity patrons that your organisation has. How important is that? Because they're in the public eye. They're subject to criticism too, and you've got lots of celebrities that are, Hugh Grant. I didn't know that he felt as strongly as he clearly does. How do you feel about that? How important are they?
It is important, and I think it's part and parcel of the kind of world we live in. People, I think, sometimes there's some griping about celebrities campaigning. My attitude is celebrities are human too, and for the people that come on board with our campaign, there's normally a personal reason as to why they're doing it. Hugh Grant and others see people they know die, and that has an impact upon them. And why shouldn't a celebrity have a view on this issue as much as Joe blogs in the street? So to take Hugh Grant, for example, I know that he was very close to a lady I knew called Dr. Anne Macpherson, who was a wonderful doctor in Oxford, who sadly had pancreatic cancer. And she said, you know what, it's ridiculous that I don't have the choice of an assisted death. And that's why kind of Hugh comes on board and other celebrities come on board, is because this issue impacts upon everybody. And why shouldn't they have a say?
Where do you think the law is going to go in 5 to 10 years? Obviously, you have what you want to happen. Where do you see it realistically going where we are today?
Well, I think the law is going to change. I think that I think it's inevitable that the law will change because there's a problem, and the problem's not going to disappear. The Swiss, they had a referendum on stopping foreigners coming to their country. As you can imagine, the Swiss might get a bit upset with this concept of their country being the place people go to die. And actually, the public voted overwhelmingly to enable people to keep coming to their country to have a peaceful death. And so the issue is not going to disappear. So long as people want choice, so long as people are sadly going to suffer at the end of life, and so long as there are ways of them taking matters into their own hands, this problem is going to continue. I think that what's going to happen as well is that we're going to see from around the world more and more jurisdictions change their laws. So we'll get even more evidence. We'll get more evidence from America and other countries as to how the law could or perhaps shouldn't work in this country. And I think given that weight and given overwhelming public support, it becomes inevitable the law changes. The big question is how does the law change? And that's the debate we're involved in at Parliament at the moment. And I think that I certainly think by the end of this decade the law will change.
James, it's not a subject that we've actually touched on yet, but what are the financial implications of bringing that law into this country? Who's going to pay for it if it does come into force? The NHS? Private? The individual?
Well, I mean, this is one thing we've looked at. I mean, in terms of the bill being forward by Lord Faulkner is a private member's bill. There's a kind of rule with private members' bills that they have to be cost neutral. And this law, in effect, is cost neutral. If anything, there may be an additional cost as more people enrol in palliative care. Because what we've seen in Oregon, for example, is that over 90% of people who have an assisted death are in receipt of hospice care. So what we would hope and what we would expect is that on the whole, there's no new systems being built in. It fits within the existing healthcare structure. We're not anticipating clinics being built. This would happen within the existing confines of the NHS. But we may see a greater uptake of people using hospice care, using palliative care, because they will be signposted by their doctor during those conversations when they raise the issue of wanting assisted death. In terms of picking up the bill for extra palliative care, well, you know, I suppose there's a very long queue of people saying society should be paying for this and paying for that. I think it's a fundamental that we want people to die well, so I would hope that there aren't too many people out there who are going to begrudge finding the additional money to pay for palliative care and end-of-life care.
James, if somebody is watching this and they want to know more information, they want to be better informed, where can they go? Because the internet is just full of so much information. How do you become well informed on a subject like this?
That's a good question. I mean, I would advise people to look at our website. I would advise people to get in touch. Our website features research and the arguments around this and the evidence from across the world. So look at our website. If this is an issue that personally affects people, we're a law that campaigns within the law to change the law. We're never ever going to provide people with information on help and assistance as to how to die. We do have a sister charity, Compassion in Dying, that deals with your existing rights as the law stands at the moment. So that there are practical steps that every one of us can take in terms of setting out our wishes in advance and filling in advance decisions so that if we lose capacity to express our wishes, that healthcare professionals know what we would want and what we wouldn't want in terms of treatment. And I would advise when people start thinking about these issues, if they're thinking about getting a financial will in terms of safeguarding the future for their family, that they should also look at making decisions about what they want and what they don't want when it comes to the end of life.
James, we're going to go to a few viewer questions now,
Sure.
so thank you very much for everyone that's got involved. Matthew, he messaged us and he said, "Who am I to say you don't have the right to die?"
I would broadly agree with Matthew's point. I think that none of us have should be able to tell someone who is dying how much suffering they can endure. That somehow they can get through it for the good of everybody else. I think Matthew's right. I think that within the context of ensuring there are safeguards, I think that ultimately it's for the dying person to decide how much suffering they can endure, and it's for the dying person to decide how and when they want to control their death.
Joe wants to know how you determine what is a mercy killing, and is that a whole different subject?
Well, we talked earlier on about the right to die, the broader right to die versus the right to die. Mercy killing is part of the broader right to die debate. I discussed the difference between Belgium and Holland and Switzerland and the American states. Mercy killing is when you move beyond assisting somebody, i.e. taking them abroad to die, helping them to get abroad to die, and you actually directly. So it's almost like euthanasia. You're playing the role of the doctor, and you are directly ending the patient's life. Now that crosses a completely different law. That's not an issue of assisted suicide. That's an issue of murder. Yeah, it's a tricky subject, but it is part of that wider debate about why people take matters into their own hands and the massive difficulties they can get into in terms of the law if you do take matters into your own hands.
Someone's also messaged us a statement that says life is for living, and they want to know what your opinion is on that statement.
Yeah, I agree. Life is for living. Life's for enjoying. But life comes to an end. And when life comes to an end, people should have choice control of that process. So I don't see how that's kind of contradictory. We're talking about people who are dying here in the last days and weeks of life. You know, they've lived their life and they want to go with dignity and peacefully.
James, it's a subject that I think we could talk about probably for the next couple of hours, but we won't.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Don't forget there's loads more videos on our channel, so make sure you continue to check back. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you shortly.